different court cases, there's one way to differentiate between two different court cases. There are civil cases and there are criminal cases. And I'm going to give you some ideas of how you can better understand this. First, let's think about civil cases. Civil cases involve somebody versus somebody else. So let's say, think of any of your classmates. Maybe they have a court case against you. Now, what we typically call this is a lawsuit. So if you were to sue someone else or some business, or a business sues you, that's somebody suing somebody. So some great examples of that. Let's say somebody breaks a contract. You might sue them about that. Or somebody breaks something that's yours. You might sue them for replacing that property. But also another great example of a civil case is divorce. Divorce is essentially a lawsuit where you are suing for the ability to break that marriage contract that you've set up. So civil cases are pretty simple. It's somebody versus somebody. It's a lawsuit where you're suing somebody. Now, what's interesting about civil cases is you only have to prove really that someone is at least 50% chance at fault. So if you can show that it looks like it's most likely their fault, they're the ones responsible for any damages. So let's say a car accident. Two people hit each other. The courts are going to decide who's most responsible, and that person's going to have to pay for the most damages in that accident. Now, criminal cases are very different. Criminal cases, right in the name, they involve a crime. So it's essentially the government versus somebody. So let's use the example right on the screen. If you don't know who that is Swiper. Let's say Swiper steals something from Dora. And that, of course, is a crime. Theft is a crime. So the government will arrest Swiper, and then they will bring a court case against him. So this is the government enforcing their laws on someone else, essentially because he's broken those laws. He's committed a crime. So giving you an example, larceny is, of course, stealing. Now, in a criminal case, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. You've probably heard that phrase before. It basically means that you have to show to the jury that it's pretty much 100% chance that this person committed the crime. So we don't want people going to jail for murder if there's a lot of doubt on whether or not they did it. So there can't be any reasonable doubt. It has to be beyond all doubt that they committed this crime. Otherwise, they're found innocent. So if in Swiper's case, they find out that it might have actually been Boots that committed the crime, the theft, if there's some sort of clue that doesn't fit with Swiper, they might end up finding Swiper innocent because they weren't 100% sure. There was some doubt in their mind. And that does happen. You need to know the difference between these two types of cases. And if you're confused in any way, please feel free to ask the substitute or myself for some more help because you are going to be using your knowledge of civil and criminal in the future in this class. Now, really, this is all about jurisdiction, the authority to hear certain cases. Some courts have jurisdiction over civil cases, and some courts have jurisdiction over criminal cases. So a court that handles criminal cases might not know anything about divorces, and the lawyers there and judges there might not be able to prepare for a case that deals with divorce. So they kind of specialize in what types of cases they focus in on. Now, also important to know is another word called appeals. Now, you've probably heard of this before. Essentially, it happens when you lose. So if you lose a court case, you have a chance to appeal it to a higher court. There's a hierarchy of courts. So imagine Supreme Courts at the top, and then there are other federal courts below them, and then there are state courts, and then there are local courts. So if you lose a case at a local court level, you could appeal that court case to a higher court level. So let's say Swiper is found guilty of stealing in Marshfield. He may be found guilty here, and then he appeals, and maybe at the state level, they find him as innocent. It's a chance to basically have someone else look at your case at a higher level. And most of these cases are heard by courts that only hear appeals. So, for example, the Wisconsin Appellate Court, all they do is hear appeals. That's what the name of their court is all about. So they just hear appeals from local jurisdictions. Another good example is Tom Brady. Tom Brady, of course, won his appeal against the NFL to have his suspension overturned. And now the NFL is appealing it to a higher court, basically saying that Tom Brady deserved to be suspended. And they want to argue that with the next higher level of judges. Now, speaking of different levels of judges, I already mentioned that there are state courts and federal courts. Now, each state has their own law system, and they have their own courts. So you can see on the screen right now, that's the Supreme Court of Wisconsin, and they know all about Wisconsin laws. But if, let's say, you disagree with a decision of that Supreme Court of Wisconsin, you certainly could appeal to a higher court, and a higher court would be a federal court. These state courts derive all their power from state laws and state constitutions. So as I said already, they kind of focus in on state law. And almost all cases are heard in state courts on some level, and most of them in local court cases. So, for example, pretty much all criminal cases, almost all divorce cases, child custody cases, juvenile cases, almost all of them get settled at a local level within the state, whether it be in like a county court or a regional court or a state court. 97% of court cases happen at the state level. Very few court cases go to the federal system. The federal system has the Supreme Court and a few lower federal courts as well that have been created by Congress, some regional courts, essentially. But they tend to handle things that deal with the Constitution. So they handle if you're accusing someone of violating the Constitution, violating your rights. They may handle a bankruptcy proceeding, because that tends to be something that's very controversial and deals with federal laws. So the federal courts deal with a very different realm. And lastly, just to show you some of the federal courts beyond the Supreme Court, you have district courts and you have appeals courts, and they tend to be regionally based. So they're the ones that hear court cases before they go to the Supreme Court. So you would have to appeal beyond these courts, first starting in the district court, then going to the circuit courts, and then you'd have to appeal and get the Supreme Court to take up your case. So it could be a very lengthy process to go from a local court case in Wood County, appealing to the Wisconsin Appeals Court, appealing to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, then appealing to the federal district courts, then appealing to the federal circuit courts, and then finally appealing to the Supreme Court of the United States. This can take years to be able to reach the Supreme Court of the United States. And that's why we don't really have a ton of Supreme Court cases, not to mention they don't have the time to really look at a great number of cases. So we have these federal courts. They handle about 3% of all court cases in the United States. So very, very few court cases, and most of those getting handled in the federal district courts. And there's the Supreme Court. Or as most people call them, SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States. Nice little nickname, instead of spelling out the Supreme Court of the United States. And you'll be researching about them in a few moments. Next, a reading.